So hi everyone, my name is Mariana Seissa and I'm here to present to you our paper entitled A Systemic Perspective on Sonification Aesthetics. And so we start out with kind of a bold statement that was the title of a paper written by John Newhoff in the last edition of ICAD, that is sonification doomed to fail? And so he stated that despite all the research and design efforts made over the last 25 years, widespread adoption of sonification has largely failed to materialize. And so he listed a series of issues that might contribute to this lack of credibility and solidity, from which we highlight the inherent complexity of interdisciplinarity that naturally characterizes the field. And so this huge challenge brings us to our main proposal with this paper. That is, what if a sonification could be devised as a living system? And so a study that fostered this proposal was a paper written by Fritjof Capra entitled Speaking Nature's Language, where he stated that 6 perceptual shifts were needed for designing sustainable societies based on nature's ecosystems and natural principles of organization. And so how can we transpose this knowledge to devise what we call a systemic sonification? And so we start out with the idea that the parts become the whole. And so each sound variable that translates some kind of data variable is seen as an element of this ecosystem. And so each of these elements suffer a series of transformations that are defined by an overall sound metaphor that establishes the systemic properties of the sonification and provides a unity of sense. The objects become relationships. And so the focus of a systemic sonification grows from devising each sound parameter as isolated straight from data values to how they can create sonic relationships with each other in a constant perceptual change. From contents, we grow to patterns, and this idea that all the networks of relationships that spread within the ecosystem reveal patterns across elements, and these patterns, more than its individual isolated contents, embody inherent complexity within the relations between data variables. From quantity, we grow to quality, and so one must invoke qualitative approaches that can see the experience through its beholder, accessing introspective and extrospective phenomena during the experience and how all the perceptual transformations that take place while being in the world. And this idea of being in the world embodies Merleau-Ponty's motto of perception requires action, or even, if we may say so, perception is action, as the meaning-making process only truly occurs through exchangeable interactions with the environment. From objective knowledge, we grow to contextual knowledge. And so the interpretative journey of the individual while wandering the ecosystem occurs within its personal context, where each human agent carries a set of pre-expectations based on personality structure and tendentious behavior. The final shift is that structure becomes process. And so more important than the initial stage of the system is how it develops over time in a constant interaction with other elements. And so the process becomes the key concept in an intertwined cycle of exchanges where each element evolves and adapts to surrounding changes. And so a living system sets this ground on all these shared principles and a structural organization that drives an holistic, integrative approach to what a systemic sonification can be. The concept of Systemism, as proposed by Mario Bianche, is the integrative perspective of elements and symbols, where everything is a system or a component of one, tied together as intertwined, stable dimensions whose bonds and relationships maintain the functionality of the whole embedded within a context. And so the author proposed the SESM model to characterize a system, from where we can build the concept for a systemic sonification S, where the composition represents the collection of sound beings P as nested systems, so every sound being is a system in itself. The environment as a collection of all the external agents that are embedded within a context that can act on or be acted upon the beings of S. Our structure that represents the acoustic relationships and bonds formed between the sound beings and the ones formed between them and the external agents, and the mechanisms and how each sound being behaves and transforms itself through interacting with other sound beings and with external agents. And these transformations mean that they can alter one or more than one component of P. And so this brings us to our sound beings P, that each one is a system in itself, composed by a collection of elements responsible for the filtering, the analysis, and mapping of each data variable. And so, thinking about the classical, or through the classical perspective of a sonification, the purpose is the task, is the learning through the idea of successfully communicating a given data set. And in a systemic sonification, the purpose grows to become the experience itself and the exploration of all the emergent elements in sonic universes that are adaptable to each participant. And so this mutable experience can then evolve to become an aesthetic experience, as an experience that enables the expansion of the perception field, offering processes of disruption, transformation that may offer insights towards a deeper understanding of the data and the transcendence of the self. And so this concept was based on this cognitive flow model of aesthetic experience that was proposed by Pawlowski and Akiba, and that is comprised by 5 stages. So the first is our pre-state. We have the users with its own self-image, holding a set of pre-expectations and tendentious behavior. Then we have the second stage of cognitive mastery, where there is a first assessment and attempt to classify and build inferences about the artifact. The third stage is that occurs when discrepancy arises between what was expected and what was perceived, and so there is an attempt to regain control, trying to reclassify the artifact and solve this tension. And this leads the user to revise his expectations in a metacognitive reassessment as the fourth stage, revising all his former knowledge, everything that he thought would be the future possibilities, and he's forced to look outside the problem, outside of himself, and in a way to lose control. And this loss of control brings us to the last and final aesthetic stage and the aesthetic outcome of the experience, where a readjustment of the self takes place and there is an expanded cognitive mastery knowledge that ultimately brings us to a true self-transformation of the self in a moment of transcendence. So bringing the concept of, or summarizing the concept of systemic thinking into a sonification process, this systemic view can be applied to 3 conceptual levels. The first, over the data set itself, devising each data variable as an element of a system. Over each sound subsystem P, so that is composed of all the data steps, filtering, analysis, and mapping functions that are constantly communicating and also adapting themselves to the external inputs. And finally, over a global systemic soundscape S, where each element P lives in a continuous interaction with each other and with the environment, from where humans can intervene and transform themselves while also transforming the system in a kind of an interactions process that encompasses the 5 stages of the aesthetic experience model with the goal of transcendence. And so we conclude with a quote by John Dewey in his book Art as Experience, that is, "Only when the past ceases to trouble and anticipations of the future are not perturbing is a being wholly united with his environment and therefore fully alive." And so a systemic perspective can offer this grounding to the sonification field, embodying all the past achievements, all the functional mapping tools to compose these sound beings, which can ultimately place each human protagonist in the center and present of the sonification process to expand the fields of perception. We are very much looking forward to all your questions, all your comments. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for a very kind of mind-opening and provocative view of aesthetics. It's certainly new to me, and I'm very curious. There's some folks here who have been working on sonification aesthetics and aesthetics of auditory displays for a long time. So I'm looking forward to questions from them. But we'll begin with a question from Prithvi. An important focus of Newhoff's paper was the trade-off between precisely conveying data content through sound and the aesthetic qualities of the representation. How would you say your system approaches this? Again, another quintessential question of auditory displays and sonification is how to balance, information or facilitation of sense making in aesthetics.
Yes, well, we could be here for hours trying to answer the question of what is aesthetics. So here, of course, we can speak about aesthetics in terms of the musical form, but here particularly, we are trying to see the aesthetics as the experience and as a channel through which that allows each human participant here to enhance and expand his or her field of perception. And so here we have a different perspective of aesthetics, more uncommon, I think. And here, so the paper, the question here, and what Newhoff particularly states in his paper is the musical characteristic, and usually the tendency for the ones who design sonifications to have a musical background usually becomes a certain bias or create a certain bias when creating the sonifications. And so
definitely. Yeah, definitely. Your work almost kind of reminds me of, and I'm sure it's inspired by, all of this kind of post-humanist, feminist, non-human relations philosophies that are emerging and kind of entering a lot of transdisciplinary fields. But I'll save that for the Q&A in Gather Town.
Yes,
Paul
please
Vickers,
come.
Yeah, I will. Paul Vickers has a question. How do you see, and Paul is someone who's worked for many years in aesthetics and auditory displays, how do you see the phenomenon of embodied perception affecting our understanding of sonification aesthetics?
Here we see the idea of a bodily presence, so a physical presence where the whole body becomes, even if I may say so, an instrument in this kind of systemic space or perception space. And so here the embodied perception is the body in its whole, and the body as the main vehicle through which each participant will weave his own experience of the sonification. So it's a very important dimension here. And the idea of perception being an active process, not a passive one.
Yeah, I love your formulation of everything. Are there any examples that you feel exemplify this kind of view of aesthetics really well that we can experience? And if not here, are there any links that you can share with us?
I'm not sure if I understood about the idea of the aesthetic as an aesthetic experience.
Are there any sound examples that
sound examples? Okay, that we have already created.
Exemplify this idea.
Not yet. This is exactly our impending challenge. This is in the course of my PhD. So now it's the billion-dollar question of how will we do this and implement this conceptual space in
let's connect. There's examples that I can think of that kind of approach your formulation of aesthetics. So yeah.
Okay, if you could share, I'm very welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any additional questions? There was a question from Philart. Oh, that was a
The
comment about
perception,
the
yeah,
original meaning
perception of the
of
senses.
aesthetic. Yeah, yeah,
Yes, from
perception
the
of the
Greek word.
senses.
I'm not
Yeah,
trying to say aesthetikos. I don't know if, if
yeah.
how to pronounce it, but yeah,
Oh,
this
we
the
have a lot of
origin.
Greeks here. They can
Yeah,
help us. Yeah.
tell me how.
If we need help.